There are stories that are not just told. They are lit within us like a flame that refuses to die. Picture the scene. Snow covering stone rooftops, the wind howling through narrow streets, and a woman walking alone. Her steps, firm, echo like drum beats in the frozen silence. She carries in her chest not only the weight of her sorrows, but the seed of something that would change lives forever. That woman is Jane Frances de Chantal. You can feel the cold seeping into the bones, the cutting breath of winter trying to force her back. But she does not turn back. She has already endured storms far harsher, the premature death of her husband, the loneliness of empty days, the struggle of raising children alone in a time when a widow was seen as a shadow. The world wanted her in the corner, resigned. But heaven wanted her in motion. And what if I told you that everything she had lived, every tear, every renunciation, every whispered prayer in the middle of the night, was preparing the ground for a miracle that would make the impossible unfold before her eyes? A miracle not born of fame or power, but of a silent faith that burns like embers hidden under ash. Jane did not begin as a saint. She began like us, vulnerable, limited, questioning God's ways. But at the right moment, she discovered that God's silence was not rejection, but an invitation to trust more. That is the same lesson your soul may need today as you listen to this story. What we will reveal here is not just the biography of a virtuous woman. It is a spiritual map for when everything in your life feels broken. It is proof that God can build cathedrals from the rubble of our hearts. That is what this story is about. If you feel, even slightly, that this message is already touching something deep within you, subscribe now to the channel, because the life of Jane Frances de Chantal will show you that even in the harshest winter, the breath of God can bring spring. The year is 1572. France breathes a heavy air. Religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants cut through the nation like invisible blades. In Dijon, Burgundy, Jane is born, daughter of Benigne Fremiot, president of the Parliament of Burgundy, and Marguerite de Berbizy. From an early age, her large, attentive eyes seemed to take in more than other children. She received a refined education, not only in letters and the arts, but also in the fear of God. While other girls dreamed of parties and dresses, Jane cultivated a serene gaze, observing how faith could either transform or destroy families. In her teens, when she was offered an advantageous marriage to a Calvinist nobleman, she said no. And it was not just a social no. It was a no from her soul, a silent commitment to the Catholic faith that pulsed in her veins. At age 20, Jane married Christophe de Raboutin, Baron of Chantal. The castle of Bourbilly, which could have been merely a symbol of status, became a spiritual beacon. Jane ordered daily mass to be celebrated and required all servants to attend. She taught catechism to the children, offered shelter to the needy, and even dressed in elegant garments, did not hesitate to sit beside the poor to hear their stories. This environment of devotion and service thrived. But fate held for her a blow that would change everything. In 1601, Christophe died in a hunting accident. Jane, at just 28 years old, found herself a widow with 4 children to raise. It was the beginning of a long journey. What could have been the end of her social life became, paradoxically, the beginning of her spiritual mission. She took a vow of chastity, dedicated herself to charity, and began to live a more withdrawn life, balancing prayer, work, and the education of her children. The banquet halls gave way to silent prayer rooms, and the castle became a refuge for wounded souls. This period was marked by a slow inner maturing. Jane learned, through every pain and every renunciation, that holiness is not born of spectacular moments, but from the quiet constancy of doing good. It was the invisible preparation for the encounter that would forever change the course of her life. Grief is not only absence, it is also presence, of longing, of memories, of the emptiness that insists on making itself felt. Jane lived that grief intensely but did not give in to despair. Still, there were nights when the weight of loneliness crushed her chest. The cold walls of the castle seemed to echo God's silence. In 1604, during a visit to Dijon, she heard the preaching of a man whose voice seemed to cross invisible barriers, Saint Frances de Sales, Bishop of Geneva. He was not just eloquent, there was in him a steady gentleness, a light that did not come from himself but from someone greater. Jane instantly felt that he was the spiritual guide she had been searching for. The friendship and spiritual direction born there was comparable to that of St. Clare and St. Francis of Assisi, a bond of souls for the work of God. Francis de Sales saw in Jane not merely a pious penitent, but a woman with a special calling. He encouraged her, guided her, and challenged her not to settle for a life of private devotion, but to open herself to something greater. Meanwhile, her personal life continued to be marked by farewells. Her son, still a teenager, went to live with his grandfather. One of her daughters died young, the other two married. Jane saw her home emptying. It was as if God was gradually removing from her hands everything that could bind her to the world, so that she would be free for him. It was in this context that the call to found a new religious congregation was born. Not a cloistered order in the rigid mold of the time, but a community open to receiving widows and women in fragile health, dedicating themselves to prayer and visiting the sick. Thus, in 1610, the Order of the Visitation of Holy Mary was born in Annecy, with the support of Francis de Sales. But the early years were not easy. The Visitandines faced criticism, resistance, and even persecution. As superior, Jane had to learn to lead with firmness and tenderness, keeping the original vision alive even in the midst of storms. It was the painful crossing that would precede the visible manifestation of God's power. Winter in Paris felt heavier that morning. The Visitation Convent, though humble, was full of movement, hushed voices, hurried footsteps, and the distant sound of a bell calling to prayer. Between the doors opening and closing, two women carried a frail figure in their arms. A sick woman, pale-faced and nearly lifeless. Her atrophied muscles told of years without movement. The air carried a bittersweet scent, a mix of medicinal herbs and the dampness rising from the old stone walls. Jane, already seasoned in tending to human suffering, approached. Her eyes scanned the woman's body with compassion, but without fear. She saw not just bones and skin. She saw a soul loved by God. Kneeling beside the makeshift bed, she took the woman's cold hand in her own. The silence that followed was almost tangible. The sisters stepped back, as if recognizing that something sacred was about to take place. With a voice low yet steady, Jane began to pray. There were no rehearsed words. These were pleas that seemed to rise from the depths of her spirit, like underground rivers finding a crack to surge upward. Jesus, honor yourself in this rescue. Your mercy is greater than death, and your love knows no bounds. Her tone was gentle, yet carried an authority not her own. Suddenly, an imperceptible breath seemed to pass through the room. The candles flickered faintly, as though moved by an unseen wind. The woman, once motionless, felt a tingling run through her hands. A finger twitched, almost imperceptible, but enough to draw a murmur from the nuns. Jane continued praying, now with tears streaming down her face. The movement spread, first the entire hand, then the arm, then the legs. With what seemed an impossible effort, the woman rose. her feet touching the floor for the first time in years. A deep sob broke the silence. It was not only hers. Some of the sisters were also weeping, unable to contain their emotion at the miracle they had just witnessed. Jane embraced her tenderly, and they remained thus for several moments, as if time itself had stopped. The episode spread quickly through Paris, drawing pilgrims and strengthening the faith of the community. For Jane, it was not cause for glory, but a reminder that the power of God manifests when the human heart is fully surrendered. From that day on, the work of the visitation gained renewed strength. The house that had faced hardships now became a beacon of hope for those seeking not only physical relief, but also healing for the wounds of the soul. That paralyzed woman who walked again is not as distant from us as it may seem. You may not be confined to a bed. But how long have you carried a heart immobilized by fear? How many dreams have you abandoned because you believed it was already too late? The legs of that woman would not move. But today many of us carry souls that no longer take a single step forward. We live in a time when paralysis is not only physical, it is emotional, spiritual, and often invisible. We remain bound by old wounds, by words that hurt us, by guilt we cannot release. We stay stuck in routines that drain our lives, looking ahead but taking no step toward it. Like that woman, we feel condemned to live this way forever. What happened in the convent in Paris was not just a supernatural display to inspire curiosity. It was a message from heaven. Faith can seep into the rusted joints of the soul, break invisible chains, and set us on our feet. Jane had no secret formula. She had a certainty. When we give God the little we have, He gives back more than we could ever imagine. Perhaps today you are paralyzed by discouragement, by anxiety, or by the weight of a life that did not turn out as you planned. Perhaps you have faith, but it is a tired faith, almost extinguished. Then hear this. The same Christ who touched that woman through Jane's hands stands before you now. He does not ask if you deserve it. He asks, do you want to be healed? The first step is not always physical. It is internal. It is deciding to rise on the inside, even if your feet are still bound. It is making room for God to act, even when the scene around you does not change immediately. Jane believed not because she saw signs, but because she knew the voice of the one who calls to life. If this story is touching an area of paralysis within you, write in the comments, I want to stand up, not just as a symbolic gesture, but as an act of faith, and share this with someone who also needs to remember that the impossible is still possible for God. The year was 1641. Winter in Moulins seemed to mirror Jane's weakened body. Fever rose, and the strength that had once moved entire convents now barely sustained her voice. Even so, her words were prayers, not supplications for herself, but intercessions for her spiritual daughters, for the poor, for the sick, for the forgotten. The bed where she lay became a silent altar, where every breath was an offering. The nuns took turns staying at her side. Some held her hand, others knelt in the corner of the room, murmuring prayers. The atmosphere was tinged with sadness, but also with a strange peace. They knew they were about to lose their foundress's physical presence, but they also knew heaven was preparing to welcome her. One quiet afternoon, the breeze that entered through the window carried with it a gentle fragrance, like freshly picked flowers, despite the cold outside. Jane opened her eyes and with a weary smile spoke only one word, Jesus. It was as if the weight of her entire life had condensed into that single name. Those who heard it knew this was her last and deepest act of faith. Witnesses recount that, at the moment of her passing, a serene expression came over her face, as if she had seen something the others could not. It was like the echo of a promise finally fulfilled. She had fought the good fight, finished the race, and kept the faith. By then, her work had far exceeded all human expectations. The Order of the Visitation counted 87 convents, and in its first century, more than 6,500 sisters spread across the world. Each of them carried a piece of Jane's spirit, the spirit of service, gentleness, firmness, and absolute trust in the Lord. And so, the life of Jane Frances de Chantal ends in time, but is eternalized in faith. As it is written, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much fruit." John 12:24. And the fruit of her life continues to nourish souls to this day. Today, centuries later, the name of Saint Jane Frances de Chantal is still spoken with reverence by those who know her story. But to many she is a forgotten saint, almost lost among the pages of church history. Yet her life shouts to us right now an eternal truth. There is no pain so deep that God cannot transform it into a mission. The miracle of the paralyzed woman's healing in Paris was only a visible sample of what heaven did through her every day. How many souls stood up spiritually because of her compassion, her counsel, and her silent prayers? How many found strength to live again simply because she dared to believe God was still at work? You may look at her life and think, "I could never live like that." But maybe God is not asking you to live like Jane. Maybe He is asking you to believe like Jane, to believe that even a small act done with love and faith can be the beginning of a miracle. And now, I ask you, what paralysis do you need to lay before God today? What pain have you kept for years, waiting for it to resolve itself? Perhaps it is time to do what Jane did. Place yourself before God without reserve, acknowledging your weakness and trusting in His power. If this story touched your heart, write now in the comments, "I believe in the God of the impossible." That phrase is not just a response. It is a commitment, a public act of faith. And if you know someone who needs this message, send them this video now. You can be the channel that carries hope to a weary soul. Subscribe to the channel to discover more stories like this, of forgotten saints, silent martyrs, and miracles the world could not erase. Because the breath of God is still moving, and perhaps the next miracle is closer than you imagine.